Minneapolis blizzard. CEO Julian Sloan sees a boy dragging his carbon fiber briefcase. A brass snowflake whistle gleams. He follows. What next? Snow roared sideways across Nicollet Mall like a white river of knives. The city was locked under a polar vortex warning, -30 with wind chill, and only a few shapes moved in the blur between glass towers. One of them was Julian Sloan, 38, CEO of Aurora Grid AI, his Italian coat dusted with ice. Behind his high-end glasses, his piercing blue eyes flicked across the frozen street as he tightened his red scarf. Inside the carbon fiber briefcase in his hand lay a prototype, a single hardware key capable of unlocking Aurora Grid's entire winter micro network. He had just left a board meeting at City Hall, emergency coordination for the blizzard, when his driver's sedan fishtailed across an icy curb. In the chaos, the briefcase slammed against the doorframe and tumbled into the storm. Julian cursed softly and stepped into the wind. It was gone, swallowed by white. At the same time, 3 blocks away, an 11-year-old boy named Ben Carter trudged through drifts that came to his knees, pulling a plastic sled loaded with bottles and scrap metal. The sled rope bit his gloveless hand. His grandmother's furnace had gone silent again, and the oxygen machine had started to sputter. He'd counted the coins in his pocket twice, still not enough for heating patches. A gust struck, and Ben ducked his head under his red knit scarf. That scarf had once belonged to his mother, who'd died 2 winters ago when their apartment pipes burst. Grandma Ruth said it was the only thing that ever stayed warm, no matter how cold the world got. Then Ben heard it, a thunk in the slush. A black case, slick with snow, had fallen from the open door of a dark sedan. The driver, shouting over the wind, didn't notice. Ben knelt, brushed off the ice, and saw the embossed Aurora Grid crest on the lid. He tapped it, heavy, metal inside. When he tilted it, coins or something metallic clinked faintly. For a moment, the storm felt quieter. He could have opened it. Maybe there was cash inside, enough to keep Grandma warm for a month. But his fingers stopped at the latch. Around his neck hung a small brass snowflake whistle, his mom's old keepsake. She'd told him once, "If you ever find something that isn't yours, you blow it 3 times. That means you're calling for its owner." Ben pressed the whistle to his lips and blew. The sound was thin against the blizzard, barely traveling past the corner. But he did it anyway. Then he tied the briefcase to the sled rope and started pulling it through the snow toward the police precinct 2 miles away. Back on the avenue, Julian reached the corner just in time to see a small figure disappear into the white, dragging something dark behind. He sprinted after, shouting, "Wait! Stop!" His voice vanished in the wind. By the time he reached the next block, his shoes were soaked, his gloves frozen, and his lungs burning. He could barely make out footprints, then tire tracks from a passing truck. The trail split. He hesitated, staring into the endless blur of snow and light. For the first time in years, Julian felt powerless. He turned back toward the Aurora Grid atrium, each step heavier. Inside the glass building, servers hummed with the energy of a city depending on him. But all he could think of was that case, the root of trust key, and the boy he'd seen vanish into the storm. At the precinct an hour later, Ben's fingers shook as he handed the case to the desk officer. "I think someone dropped this," he said quietly. "It's got that power company sign on it." The officer blinked, surprised. "You dragged this here, in this weather?" Ben nodded. His voice was hoarse. It looked important. When Julian burst through the precinct doors minutes later, frost clinging to his hair, the room fell silent. His tailored coat dripped onto the tiles as he rushed to the counter. Someone turned in a briefcase. Aurora Grid crest. Black carbon fiber? The officer pointed. "That kid just brought it." Julian turned. A small boy in a threadbare parka stood by the radiator, steam rising from his clothes. Around his neck glinted a brass snowflake whistle. Julian's gaze dropped to his own tie pin. the same snowflake emblem from a firefighter memorial he'd sponsored years ago. Something in his chest tightened. He crossed the room slowly. "You found this in the snow?" Ben nodded. "It fell off a car door." Julian opened the briefcase just enough to see the silver hardware key resting inside. Relief hit him like a wave. "You have no idea what you just saved," he said. The boy shrugged, eyes down. "Just wanted to get it back to whoever lost it." Julian reached into his wallet, pulled out a $100 bill, and held it out. "Take this." "You earned it." Ben shook his head. "No, sir. I just need a bus card. And maybe a pack of heating patches for my grandma. She's sick." Julian froze. "Your grandma?" Ben nodded, pulling his red scarf tighter. "Her oxygen tank's almost empty. The landlord said the heat's off till Monday because of some cost issue." Steam rose between them from their soaked coats. The detective who'd logged the case cleared his throat softly. "Kid says he dragged it 2 miles from Franklin Avenue. Whole way on foot." Julian looked at Ben again. His cracked lips, frost-burned knuckles, the snowflake whistle glinting faintly against the red scarf. Something unspoken passed between them, the warmth of honesty in a frozen world. Julian exhaled slowly. "Tell me where you live." The boy hesitated. "Across from the old train yard." "Building's cold, but Grandma says at least the pipes still work." Julian nodded once, decision already forming in his mind. Outside, the snow thickened, blanketing Minneapolis in silence. Somewhere far above the city, Aurora Grid's satellites tracked every heating outage, but no algorithm could yet predict the warmth of a boy's conscience. And Julian Sloan, standing in that precinct lobby with steam rising around him, realized that for the first time all winter, he wasn't thinking about data or power grids. He was thinking about a promise he hadn't made yet, but would. The storm deepened overnight, howling against glass towers like a living thing. At Aurora Grid's downtown command center, emergency maps pulsed with red and orange nodes, buildings losing heat faster than backup generators could compensate. Yet Julian's focus wasn't on the numbers. It was on the address Ben had given him. 2170 Franklin Avenue, 3rd floor. The place was marked low priority in the city's energy distribution grid, flagged for unpaid invoices. But what the system couldn't see was the human cost hiding inside those red pixels. By dawn, Julian was in his SUV, heater on max, following a snowplow through half-buried streets. He'd called ahead. No answer. He parked near the curb, boots crunching ice, and pushed through the drifting snow until he reached the building. The front door barely hung on its hinges. The lobby smelled faintly of gas and mold. He climbed to the 3rd floor and knocked. It took nearly a minute before the door opened a crack. A frail woman with graying hair and hollow cheeks peered out, bundled in 2 sweaters and a quilted shawl. "Mrs. Carter?" Julian asked gently. She blinked in confusion. "Do I know you? I met your grandson last night. He returned something of mine." Her eyes softened. "You're the man with the case." She coughed, gripping the doorframe for balance. "That boy. He's got more sense than most grown men." Ben's voice echoed faintly from inside. "Grandma, it's him!" Julian stepped in carefully. The air was icy, every breath visible. A small oxygen tank hissed weakly beside the couch. The furnace was off, pipes rattling from the cold. He saw the red scarf draped on a chair, its fabric thinning but carefully mended. "Sir," Ben said, standing near the window, "I didn't tell you yesterday, but the landlord shut off the gas. Said the bills were too high and that Grandma's oxygen tank was not his problem." I tried shoveling snow for neighbors, but Julian raised a hand, voice calm. "You did more than anyone should at your age. Let me handle this." He pulled out his phone and called Aurora Grid's emergency line. "This is Sloan. Patch me to facilities ops. I want immediate reactivation of gas service at 2170 Franklin Avenue. Market humanitarian override." The operator stammered. "Sir, we need legal clearance for—" "I am the clearance," he said sharply. Do it. Ben stared, wide-eyed, as Julian ended the call. Grandma Ruth frowned. You didn't have to. Yes, ma'am, Julian interrupted softly. I did. He glanced around the apartment, stacks of old postcards on a shelf, each stamped with Minnesota Winter Carnival. A small terrier slept curled on a rug by the window, its fur trembling from cold. What's his name? Scout, Ben said. Mom found him on the road one winter, said he was our good luck dog. Julian crouched beside the animal, scratching behind its ears. He looks brave. Ben grinned faintly. He's small, but he doesn't give up. That line stuck with Julian longer than it should have. A knock came at the door, an Aurora Grid field engineer in a reflective parka. Mr. Sloan, furnace reactivation confirmed. But you should see this. Lines are cracked. Somebody tampered with the shutoff valve. Julian's jaw tightened. Document it. Full report. He turned back to Ruth. Who manages the building? She hesitated. Name's Colton Realty. They said we were lucky to have a roof at all. He nodded grimly. You won't have to deal with them alone anymore. As warmth began to creep into the room, Julian noticed a framed photo on the counter, a young woman with Ben's same eyes laughing in the snow. His gaze lingered. Your mother? Ben nodded. She worked night shifts at a diner, slipped on the stairs one morning after they iced over. The silence stretched, heavy as the storm outside. Julian removed his gloves, flexing his hands. You know, Ben, most people would have opened that briefcase. You could have taken the money chip, sold it. No one would have known. Ben looked down. Grandma always says we don't keep what's not ours. She says the snow's clean because it gives back what it takes. Julian swallowed hard. That simple truth hit harder than any boardroom debate he'd ever had. He pulled a small envelope from his coat and handed it over. That's for you, a bus card, and enough to get groceries for the week. Consider it company reimbursement for your service. Ben shook his head again. I didn't do it for money. I know, Julian said. That's why it means something. Ruth's eyes shimmered as she touched the red scarf around her shoulders. You're a good man, Mr. Sloan. The world needs more like you. Julian smiled faintly, though his expression carried fatigue. I'm just trying to catch up to what your grandson already understands. Outside, the wind began to ease, the first break in the storm. He left after confirming the furnace ran steady, promising to return with supplies. As his SUV rolled down Franklin Avenue, he glanced in the rearview mirror. Through the window, Ben waved once, the brass whistle glinting in the pale morning light. That image burned into Julian's mind, the boy who gave back a fortune he could never spend. Back at headquarters, the boardroom felt smaller than usual. Steam still clung to Julian's coat collar as he addressed the directors. We had an incident, he began. A lost security key. A boy found it, returned it. The CFO frowned. Should we alert PR? Craft a press statement? Julian shook his head. No press, just gratitude. One director leaned forward. Sir, this could have caused chaos. If the public finds out, Julian's voice was quiet but firm. If the public finds out that a child saved this city's power grid, and all we did was spin it for marketing, that'll be chaos enough. The room fell silent. He turned to the frosted window, watching snow drift past the skyline. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man leading a company. He felt like one trying to find a soul he'd misplaced somewhere between ambition and empathy. As he left the boardroom, he murmured almost to himself, that boy deserves more than a thank you. And in his pocket, he felt the cold metal of his snowflake tie pin press against his palm, an unspoken promise forming beneath the storm's retreat. By the next morning, Minneapolis was half buried. Snowplows carved narrow tunnels through white drifts, and the Mississippi steamed faintly under frozen air. Julian sat in his corner office overlooking the skyline, untouched coffee cooling beside him. On his desk lay the carbon fiber briefcase, cleaned, sealed, and once again heavy with meaning. He had barely slept. The memory of Ben's cracked hands and Ruth's shaking breaths wouldn't let him rest. He'd grown up in this city too, comfortable, insulated, never realizing how close the cold could come to killing someone. Julian picked up his phone and called a name from an older contact list. Alex Navarro, Private Investigations. "Julian Sloan," came the voice, low and amused. "You finally got bored of boardrooms?" "Not quite," Julian said. "I need quiet work done. A building on Franklin Avenue. Colton Realty manages it. Check for illegal furnace shutoffs, falsified invoices, tenant complaints, and Alex, discretion." "Understood," Alex replied. "Why the sudden civic interest?" "Because someone did the right thing when the rest of us didn't." Julian hung up and leaned back, exhaling. Across the office, a framed mission statement read, "AI for a warmer world." It suddenly felt like a lie. An hour later, his assistant, Mara, knocked. "Sir, there's a reporter from the Chronicle. She heard about the lost case, wants a statement." Julian frowned. "Tell her no comment. She says she spoke to the precinct. There's a kid involved, Ben Carter?" He looked up sharply. "How much does she know?" "Enough to ask whether the boy's family will be compensated." Julian sighed, rubbing his temples. "Mara, schedule a medical consult for Ruth Carter through our wellness outreach. Quietly. No branding, no photos." "Yes, sir." "And if that reporter calls again, tell her the truth. Aurora Grid's CEO got lucky a good kid found what he dropped. End of story." But it wasn't the end. Not for Julian. That evening, Alex called back. "You were right to be suspicious. The building's listed under Colton Realty, but the furnace company's invoices were falsified. Someone manually closed the main gas valve 3 weeks ago. Violation of state health codes." Julian's tone sharpened. "Can you prove it?" "Already sent you the photos. Tenant records show multiple medical complaints. One flagged case. Ruth Carter, oxygen dependent. There's also a court notice for unpaid fees on their apartment. Looks like the landlord's pushing them out." Julian stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "Pushes them out into a Minnesota winter," he muttered. "For what? Profit on redevelopment?" Alex hesitated. "You planning to go public with this?" "Not yet," Julian said. "First, I'm going to fix it." After the call, Julian opened the digital file. There was Ben's address, school attendance logs, utility reports. Truancy spikes on severe cold days. Missing assignments marked family emergency. The boy had been shoveling sidewalks instead of sitting in class. Julian closed his eyes, the image of the red scarf vivid in his mind. That night, he drove back to Franklin Avenue with 2 space heaters and a duffel of groceries. Ben opened the door, startled. "Mr. Sloan?" Julian smiled gently. "You said you needed heat. I brought backup." Ruth sat up on the couch, wrapped in quilts. "You shouldn't have, dear. We'll manage." Julian set the heaters near the wall sockets. "It's temporary. I'm having your furnace fixed by morning." Ben's eyes widened. "For real?" "Promise," Julian said. He unpacked groceries, soup cans, bread, milk, medicine. Scout, the terrier, sniffed each bag before curling against Julian's shoes. Ruth chuckled weakly. "He doesn't take to strangers often." Julian smiled. "Maybe he knows I'm not staying a stranger." For a moment, the apartment glowed faintly with orange warmth. Ben perched on the arm of the couch, watching him. "Why are you helping us?" Julian hesitated. "Because sometimes people forget what their work is really for, and sometimes someone like you reminds them." Ben tilted his head. "What do you do?" "I build systems that keep cities warm," Julian said softly. "But lately, I've been realizing warmth doesn't just mean heat." The boy frowned in thought, then grinned shyly. "My mom used to say that too." Julian's heart clenched. She sounds like she was smart. "She was," Ben said quietly. "She said the world's cold. But people don't have to be." Julian turned away, blinking against the sting in his eyes. As he left, the snow began again, gentler this time. From his car, he looked back and saw Ben standing by the window, scout in his arms, brass whistle glinting like a star. When he returned to headquarters, an email waited from the security division. Root of trust audit complete. Key integrity verified. Incident logged as no breach. Julian stared at it, then deleted the message. There were bigger things than hardware security now. He opened a new memo addressed to Aurora Grid's board. Effective immediately, launch an internal review of all third-party contractors involved in winter emergency services. Prioritize low-income and medical risk zones. I'll handle budget approval. The board would complain. He didn't care to, because somewhere in that frozen city, a boy had proven that honor didn't need wealth, and Julian intended to build a company worthy of that boy's trust. He leaned back, snow swirling beyond the glass, and murmured, "You saved more than a briefcase, kid." And for the first time in his career, the CEO of Aurora Grid felt what true power meant. Not control, but compassion. The next morning dawned pale and brittle, the kind of cold that made metal groan and glass ache. Aurora Grid's skyscraper glimmered under frost, every pane reflecting the colorless winter sun. Inside, the boardroom buzzed with low murmurs as executives shuffled quarterly reports, their expressions tight. Julian entered without his usual briskness. His tailored coat was still dusted with snow, his red tie slightly loosened. When he set the carbon fiber briefcase on the polished table, the hum died instantly. "Gentlemen, ladies," he said quietly, "before we begin, I need to make something clear. Yesterday, a child dragged this briefcase 2 miles through a blizzard to return it. That single act of honesty might have saved this city from a grid collapse." A few exchanged glances. The CFO adjusted his glasses. "That's commendable, Julian, but I assume our concern here is ensuring such an event doesn't happen again." Julian's gaze didn't waver. "Our concern," he said, "is why a child had to choose between returning corporate property and keeping his grandmother from freezing." An uncomfortable silence followed. Elliot Marin, the head of investor relations, leaned forward. "Are you suggesting we intervene in every household with unpaid heating bills? Aurora Grid's purpose is infrastructure management, not welfare distribution." "Then maybe it's time we redefine what infrastructure means," Julian replied. The general counsel cleared her throat. "Julian, if this is about PR, it's not about PR," he cut in, voice sharpening. "It's about moral responsibility. That boy's honesty saved us. His grandmother's suffering exposes what we ignore daily, the human side of the grid we built." The COO frowned. "You're asking us to create charity programs in the middle of a recession?" "I'm not asking," Julian said evenly. "I'm implementing. We'll start an emergency fund. Heat and oxygen subsidies for high-risk households flagged by our sensors. Quietly. Efficiently." A director scoffed. "You're opening us to liability." Julian leaned forward, his blue eyes suddenly colder than the glass outside. What liability outweighs a grandmother's life? No one spoke. He exhaled, softer now. "Look, we claim Aurora Grid is AI with empathy. But empathy isn't a tagline. It's action. If a machine can detect heat loss, then we, the humans who built it, can decide to act on that data." Mara, his assistant, stepped in quietly with a folder. "Mr. Sloan, Field Ops confirmed tampering at 2170 Franklin. Gas valve manually closed, not mechanical failure." Julian nodded, accepting the report. "And there's your liability, gentlemen. Neglect. Illegal and lethal." The CFO rubbed his temples. "If we expose the landlord, we'll be dragged into legal noise for months." "Then so be it," Julian said. "I've retained counsel already. The landlord's about to learn what real exposure feels like." When the meeting adjourned, tension lingered like static. As the board members filed out, Mara lingered by the door. "You know they'll push back," she murmured. Julian gave a tired smile. "They can push, I'll still move. Later that afternoon, he visited the hospital. Ruth Carter had been admitted overnight after a brief collapse from oxygen depletion. The ER smelled faintly of disinfectant and melting snow. Ben sat beside her bed, clutching his brass whistle. "Hey," Julian said softly, approaching. Ben looked up, exhausted but relieved. "They said she'll be okay, just tired." Ruth smiled faintly through her oxygen mask. "You again," she said, voice thin but warm. "You really don't know how to leave us alone, do you?" Julian chuckled. "I'm afraid not, ma'am." He glanced at the monitors. "How are you feeling?" "Better than last night," she said. "Hospital's warm. And this one," she nudged Ben, "hasn't stopped worrying." Ben's eyes shone. "I thought she'd stop breathing, Mr. Sloan." Julian crouched beside him. "She's tougher than the storm, Ben. You both are." The boy nodded slowly, then whispered, "Did you get in trouble for helping us?" Julian smiled faintly. "Let's just say some people don't understand that warmth isn't measured in degrees." Ben looked confused. "Then how do you measure it?" Julian paused. "In what we give, not what we keep." Ruth blinked away tears. "You sound like my daughter." He turned to her, caught off guard. "She used to say that?" "All the time," Ruth said. "She believed kindness was a kind of currency." Julian swallowed, unable to speak for a moment. Outside the window, snowlight shimmered across the city. He thought of his sleek office, his company's glowing mission statement, and how little those things had ever really meant compared to this room, this family fighting the cold with nothing but courage and care. "Ben," Julian said after a pause, "what would you think about visiting Aurora Grid sometime? See how the systems work?" The boy's eyes widened. "For real?" Julian smiled. "For real. You helped protect them, after all. Seems fair you should know how it all fits together. Can I bring Scout?" Julian laughed softly. "We'll see what the building policy says." Ruth chuckled weakly, color returning to her cheeks. "You've made his week." Julian shook his head. "He made mine first." When he left the hospital that night, the air was crisp, the storm finally fading. But something deeper stirred in him, a realization he couldn't quite name yet. Back in his car, he held his snowflake tie pin between his fingers and looked at its mirrored reflection in the glass. The same symbol gleamed on Ben's whistle. Two pieces of metal linked by coincidence, or something more deliberate. He whispered into the stillness, "Maybe it's time I remember what this symbol was supposed to stand for." And for the first time, Julian Sloan, architect of artificial warmth, felt a flicker of genuine heat in his chest. Snow softened to a quiet shimmer over Minneapolis that morning, blanketing the world in white calm. But inside Aurora Grid's headquarters, the air carried tension sharp enough to cut. The board had reconvened early, demanding answers. Julian stood at the far end of the conference table, the city skyline glowing behind him like a ghost of light. "Mr. Sloan," began Elliot Marin, the head of investor relations, "your unilateral actions have put us in a precarious position. You authorized personal funds to repair a private residence and ordered an unsanctioned humanitarian override. That's not protocol, it's precedent." Julian kept his voice steady. "You're right. It is precedent, one I intend to keep." Laughter, thin and incredulous, rippled across the room. Another director said, "Julian, we sympathize, but emotional decisions are not sustainable. Aurora Grid is a technology company, not a social service." Julian's gaze drifted briefly to the snowflake tie pin on his lapel. "Technology without compassion is machinery," he replied quietly. "And machinery, left to itself, can kill as easily as it can heat." The CFO exhaled sharply. "You're thinking like a charity founder, not a CEO." Julian turned toward the window, watching flakes spiral past the glass. "Maybe that's the problem. Maybe CEOs stopped thinking like humans." Silence. Even the ventilation seemed to pause. When the meeting adjourned, he didn't wait for rebuttals. He walked straight to the elevator, phone in hand. His reflection in the mirrored door looked older somehow, less composed, more awake. He dialed Alex Navarro. "Did you find anything on Colton Realty's finances?" "Plenty," Alex said. "Fake maintenance reports, kickbacks from a furnace supplier. They shut off heat to push tenants into eviction. Classic exploitation." Julian's jaw tightened. "Send me everything. I'll handle it from here." After the call, he went to the Aurora Grid Design Lab, the heart of his company. Servers hummed, and holographic grids projected neighborhoods across the city, pulsing with live temperature data. His lead engineer, Priya, looked up from a console. "Julian, you're early. I didn't expect—" He gestured to the glowing map. "Show me heat failures within 3 miles of Franklin Avenue." She tapped a few keys. Dozens of red dots blinked on the screen. "These are flagged low-income buildings," she said softly. "Some have repeated shutoffs this month, but we can't override municipal limits without approval." Julian nodded. "You can, if I sign off. Reroute temporary power from Sector B's advertising displays. Those waste more electricity in a night than these families use in a week." Priya hesitated. "That'll trigger a budget inquiry." "Let it," Julian said. "We'll call it a pilot program. Humanitarian load balancing." She gave a faint smile. "You've changed, Julian." He looked at her, thoughtful. "Maybe I'm just remembering what this company was built for." Meanwhile, across town, Ben stood by his grandmother's hospital bed, polishing his brass whistle with a tissue. He'd promised himself he'd never lose it. The nurse smiled as she adjusted Ruth's blanket. "That your lucky charm?" Ben nodded proudly. "My mom gave it to me. It means you always come back home." When Julian arrived, he found Ben asleep in a chair, Scout curled at his feet. He gently placed a grocery bag on the counter, fresh fruit, inhaler refills, and a new pair of gloves. Ruth stirred awake. "You again," she murmured with a tired smile. Julian chuckled softly. "I told you I'd check in." She nodded toward the sleeping boy. "He's been talking about you nonstop. Says you're fixing the city." Julian's gaze softened. "He's giving me the reason to." She studied him quietly. "You're different from what I imagined when he said CEO. You look tired, but lighter somehow." He smiled faintly. "That's what happens when you stop chasing cold numbers and start chasing something real." Her eyes filled with warmth. "You've got a good heart, Mr. Sloan. Don't let them freeze it." Julian didn't answer. He just reached over, gently tucking Ben's red scarf tighter around his shoulders. Later that evening, as he drove through the sleeping city, his dashboard lit with alerts: furnace outages, voltage spikes, power reroutes. Aurora Grid's AI assistant pinged. "Unusual consumption pattern detected. Confirm override?" Julian smiled grimly. "Confirm. Warm the city." For the first time in weeks, the automated grid surged. Not for profit, but for people. Neighborhood by neighborhood, dim windows flickered back to life. Miles away, in the Carter apartment, the radiator clicked on. Scout lifted his head, then curled back down, tail wagging. Ruth murmured in her sleep, warmth returning to her hands. And in his downtown office, Julian stood at the window, watching faint orange halos spread through the snow. The city pulsed like a living organism, breathing warmth again. He felt the brass hardware key inside the carbon fiber briefcase against his palm. Such a small object, yet almost the weight of an entire city's fate. He glanced at his tie pin once more, then imagined Ben's whistle gleaming in the dark. One symbol forged in business, the other in love, and somehow both leading him toward redemption. Julian whispered, "You did the right thing, Ben. Now it's my turn." At that same moment, miles away, Ben stirred in his sleep, sensing warmth for the first time in months. He smiled unconsciously and whispered into the pillow, "Thanks, Mom." Outside, snowflakes drifted like blessings. By dawn, the city looked reborn. Chimneys smoked again, and the frozen skyline shimmered under a weak but honest sun. Inside Aurora Grid headquarters, the servers purred with new life as emergency subsystems rerouted power to the poorest zones. Yet, the air in Julian's office carried a quiet storm. Mara entered holding a thick file. "Alex's investigation came through," she said, setting it on his desk. "It's bad." Julian flipped it open. Photographs. Dozens of them. Frozen pipes, cracked gas valves, eviction notices pinned over frost-covered doors. Each time-stamped, each attached to a name. Colton Realty's name appeared on almost every page. "They've been shutting off heat illegally for years," Mara continued. "Then, forcing tenants out and flipping those units to luxury condos. They're using ghost maintenance invoices to justify it." Julian clenched his jaw. "How many buildings?" 37, most in low-income districts. He stared at the photos. "They killed people, Mara. Maybe not with their hands, but with greed." She hesitated. "Are you going public?" He shook his head slowly. "Not yet. We'll do it the right way. Legal filings, whistleblower evidence, public record, all airtight, no theatrics." She nodded, understanding his tone. Before she left, she added softly, "You know the board won't back this." Julian looked up. "They don't need to. Aurora Grid servers already know what warmth looks like. Now it's our turn to catch up." That afternoon, he drove to Franklin Avenue again. Snow plows had carved neat tunnels through the drifts, but the sidewalks still crunched with ice. When he reached the building, crews were already working on the furnace under his private order. Ben was waiting outside, bundled in his red scarf, brass whistle gleaming in the sun. "Mr. Sloan, Grandma's home. They said she can leave the hospital tomorrow." Julian smiled. "That's the best news I've heard all week." The boy grinned shyly. "She says you're our guardian angel." Julian chuckled. "If I'm an angel, I still have a lot of learning to do." Ben held up his whistle proudly. "Want to know the code?" "The code?" 3 blasts mean help. 1 means I'm okay. 2 means come quick. Mom taught me before she, Julian's throat tightened. "I'll remember that." The boy nodded solemnly. "You should have one too." Julian blinked. "What?" Ben reached into his pocket and pulled out a small brass whistle, an identical one, slightly tarnished. "I had another one from when I was little. You can keep it. That way we match." Julian froze. The metal was warm from the boy's hand. "Ben, I can't." "Please," Ben interrupted. "It's lucky." Julian accepted it carefully, the weight tiny yet immense. "Thank you, Ben." "I'll keep it safe." He tucked it into his coat pocket beside his snowflake tie pin. The 2 metals clicked faintly, as if recognizing each other. Later that night, Aurora Grid's board called an emergency session. The story had leaked, an anonymous tip to the Minneapolis Chronicle describing Aurora Grid's CEO secretly funding winter relief for evicted families. The screen in Julian's office flashed with the headline before he even answered the first call. "Is Julian Sloan a hero or a liability?" Elliot Marin's voice came sharp through the speaker. "Julian, what were you thinking? We've got investors panicking. They're calling it a rogue operation." Julian leaned back in his chair. "If saving lives is rogue, then maybe I'm exactly what this company needs." "This could sink our stock," another director snapped. Julian exhaled. "Stocks recover. People don't." Mara slipped quietly into the room, handing him a printout. "Statement draft," she whispered. Julian glanced at it, then looked back toward the conference camera. "You all built a company based on control, of data, of systems, of energy. But the truth is, control isn't power. Compassion is. And if that scares you, maybe it should." The line went silent. When the call ended, Julian finally let the exhaustion wash over him. He loosened his tie, staring at the brass whistle in his hand. The faint reflection of his office light glinted off its edge like a signal in the dark. Across town, Ben sat at the hospital bedside, showing Ruth a drawing he'd made. Julian standing under falling snow, holding the same whistle. Ruth smiled weakly. "He looks like he's part of the family," she said. "He kind of is," Ben whispered. "I think he just doesn't know it yet." At midnight, Julian stood alone on the Aurora Grid roof, wind whipping his coat. The city stretched below him, streetlights glowing, furnaces alive again, smoke curling from rooftops like ghosts warmed back to life. He raised the whistle to his lips and blew once. The sound cut through the night, clear, defiant, and small. Far below, somewhere across the sleeping city, a boy stirred, heard something in his dreams, and smiled. Julian lowered the whistle, eyes glistening against the cold. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone in his city. The next morning brought blue sky, brittle and deceptive. The storm had passed, but inside Aurora Grid's upper floors, tension brewed like another front. The PR division flooded Julian's inbox with crisis memos, stock dips, headlines, investor chatter. His assistant Mara waited by the window with a tablet in hand. "Sir," she began carefully, "the Chronicles article went viral overnight. They're calling you the Snowfall Samaritan." Julian half smiled. "That's catchy." "It's also chaos," she continued. "We're getting interview requests from CNN, Bloomberg, even a morning show, and the board's demanding a controlled statement before noon." Julian leaned on his desk, looking out over the sunlit city. "What about Ben and Ruth? Any reporters find them?" "Not yet," she said. "I redirected inquiries, but if the story keeps spreading, it's only a matter of time." He nodded grimly. "Then we keep them out of the spotlight." "They've already been through enough?" She hesitated before adding, "Sir, with respect, the board wants to issue a reward publicly to make this a brand story." Julian turned sharply. "A brand story? That boy froze his hands doing what grown men wouldn't. We're not turning him into a marketing mascot." Mara nodded quietly. "I thought you'd say that." A knock interrupted them. The door opened, revealing the CFO, Edward Kane, a lean man with frost-colored hair and eyes like polished ice. "Julian," he said smoothly, "the board insists you step back from external statements. You're emotionally compromised." Julian didn't look away. "Meaning?" "Meaning," Kane said, "you've crossed from leadership into personal crusade. You're turning Aurora Grid into your charity project." Julian straightened. "I'm turning it into what it was meant to be. A shield, not a brand." Kane folded his arms. "You're jeopardizing billions in municipal contracts. The state legislature is already calling for hearings. They think we're manipulating humanitarian programs for profit." Julian's jaw tightened. "Then they can audit everything. I've got nothing to hide." Kane's tone cooled further. "You forget. The shareholders do." Mara stepped forward, voice low. "Mr. Kane, with all due respect, Julian's the reason we even have an operational grid this winter. Maybe you should consider that before lecturing him about compassion." Kane's eyes flicked toward her. "I'll remember your tone, Miss Patel." Julian stepped between them. "That's enough. I'll issue a statement, on my terms." Meeting adjourned. Kane left, the door closing sharply behind him. Julian turned back to the window. From this height, Minneapolis looked peaceful, steam drifting from chimneys, roads carved through snow, but he knew how fragile that warmth was. That evening, Julian drove back to Franklin Avenue. Ben met him at the stairwell, his cheeks pink from cold, the brass whistle gleaming at his neck. "Mr. Sloan!" the boy exclaimed. "Grandma's home." Julian smiled, carrying a grocery box up the steps. "Then this calls for celebration." Inside, the apartment glowed with soft lamplight. Ruth sat propped on the couch, color back in her face, Scout sleeping across her lap. "You're a hard man to keep up with," she teased. "Every time I blink, you've done something else impossible." Julian chuckled. "You flatter me, ma'am." "How's the heat?" "Like spring," she said. "Feels strange after so long." Ben tugged his sleeve. "Grandma said when people help you, you're supposed to return it somehow, but I can't give you anything." Julian knelt, eye level with the boy. "You already did. You reminded me what my work is for." Ben smiled shyly. "Then can I help you at your company someday?" Julian's throat tightened. "I think that could be arranged." He unpacked the box, fruits, milk, new winter coats. Ruth laughed softly. "You're spoiling us." "Just repaying a debt," Julian said. As they ate dinner together, simple stew and fresh bread, the warmth in that small room felt truer than anything Julian had ever felt in a boardroom. He listened as Ben told stories about his mother, how she used to take him skating on frozen ponds, how she'd wear the red scarf he now kept. "She said the cold makes you see what matters," Ben said, "because when everything freezes, you find out what still burns inside." Julian's chest ached. "She was right," he whispered. Hours later, back at headquarters, Julian reviewed the documents Alex had sent. Affidavits, invoices, and legal drafts. They were ready to take Colton Realty to court. He leaned back, rubbing his eyes. Then his phone buzzed. Unknown number. "Mr. Sloan," said a gruff voice. "You don't know me, but I manage one of Colton's sites. My boss told me to destroy some files. Tenant complaints, old maintenance logs. But I heard what you're doing. You deserve to know. There's a ledger in their office showing off-the-books payments to inspectors. If you want justice, find that ledger before they burn it." The line went dead. Julian stared at the phone, pulse quickening. He called Alex. "Change of plans," he said. "We're going after proof tonight." An hour later, Julian and Alex parked outside a shabby office complex in the industrial district. The wind cut like glass through the cracked windows. "You sure about this?" Alex muttered. "You're a CEO, not a detective." Julian zipped his coat higher. "I'm also a man who's tired of pretending that knowing is enough." They slipped inside. The building was dark except for a faint green exit sign. Julian's flashlight swept across a plaque. Colton, Realty, and Holdings. Papers littered the floor, boxes half-packed. Then he saw it. A metal filing cabinet by the wall, a faint lock of soot along its rim. Someone had tried to burn it. Alex pried it open. Inside, charred but legible, lay ledgers stamped with signatures. Proof of falsified inspections, cash bribes, and deliberate furnace shutoffs. Julian photographed every page. "This is it," he whispered. "This ends tonight." A sound echoed. A door creaked from the hall. Alex tensed. "We're not alone." Julian turned off the light. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. "Who's there?" A man's voice called. Julian recognized it instantly. Edward Kane. He stepped from the shadows, holding a flashlight. "Julian," he said coolly, "I hoped you'd be smarter than this." Julian's stomach dropped. "You're working with Colton?" Kane's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Partnerships, Julian. You know how the world works. Their development firm funds a third of our municipal contracts. You expose them, you sink us." Julian's voice hardened. "You're willing to let people die to protect your balance sheet?" "I'm willing," Kane said, stepping closer, "to protect what we built." Julian raised the ledger. "What you built is rot. What I'm building, finally, means something." For a long moment, only the wind howled outside. Then Kane said coldly, "You're finished." Julian didn't answer. He just walked past him, snow crunching under his boots, the ledger tucked under his arm like a flame that couldn't be put out. Behind him, Kane's voice echoed down the corridor. "You think they'll thank you for this, Julian? Heroes freeze alone." Julian paused at the door and looked back. "Then I'll freeze, knowing I did the right thing." He stepped into the night, snow swallowing his footprints. The ledger pressed close to his heart. The wind clawed at Julian's coat as he and Alex reached the SUV. Their breath fogged against the windshield while the engine struggled to start in the sub-zero air. Julian gripped the steering wheel, the ledger secured in his lap inside a waterproof folder. "This is proof enough to bury them," Alex said. "Bribes, forged signatures, illegal shutoffs, all signed by Colton executives, and Kane's name shows up twice." Julian's knuckles whitened. "He's been protecting them for years." "More than protecting," Alex said grimly. "He's been profiting." Julian stared out through the fogged glass at the city skyline glowing faintly in the distance. Then he's going to face the same cold he let others suffer. The next morning, Aurora Grid's office lights were still dark when Julian arrived. He left the car idling out front and strode straight to the executive floor, the folder tucked under his arm. Security nodded, startled by his expression. He entered the boardroom without knocking. Kane and 3 directors sat waiting, coffee steaming, expressions tight. "Morning," Julian said coolly. "You left something off the agenda." Kane smiled thinly. "Julian, this isn't the time for theatrics." Julian dropped the ledger onto the table with a thud. Pages fanned open, furnace shutoff logs, kickback transfers, and a photo of Kane's signature. "You sure? Because this looks like the perfect time." The room went still. Kane's expression flickered, then hardened. "Where did you get that?" Julian folded his arms. "From a place you forgot existed, the side of the city that pays for your comfort." One of the directors flipped through the pages, her face paling. "Is this real?" Julian nodded. "Colton Realty killed people through neglect, and this company's silence enabled it. I won't let that continue." Kane rose to his feet. "You're delusional if you think dragging us through scandal helps anyone." Julian's voice stayed calm, controlled. "It helps the next family who won't freeze to death in their sleep." Another director whispered, "This could trigger a federal inquiry." "Then so be it," Julian said. "We'll cooperate fully." Kane slammed a fist on the table. "You're destroying everything we built." Julian met his glare. "No, Edward. I'm rebuilding what we promised it would be." Silence. Outside the glass walls, snow blew sideways across the skyline like ash. Then Julian turned toward Mara, who'd just entered quietly with her tablet. "File the ledger with the state attorney's office," he said evenly. "Today." Mara's eyes flickered with pride. "Yes, sir." Kane's voice cracked in disbelief. "You can't just—" Julian cut him off. "Watch me." That night, news broke across every major outlet. Aurora Grid CEO blows whistle on illegal heat shutoffs. Corporate partners under investigation. Public reaction was electric. Some hailed Julian as a reformer. Others called him reckless. Stocks fell 10% overnight, then rebounded just as fast as donations poured in for the victims' families. Julian ignored the headlines. He was at the Carter apartment, helping Ruth unpack oxygen supplies delivered under Aurora Grid's new relief initiative. "You look like a man who's been through a storm," she said kindly. Julian smiled tiredly. "Feels about right." Ben came bounding from the kitchen, cheeks flushed. "The news said you're in trouble." Julian knelt, meeting his eyes. "Not trouble, just telling the truth." Ben frowned. "Grandma says truth makes enemies." Julian smiled faintly. "Maybe, but it also makes change." The boy hesitated, then pulled the brass whistle from his neck. "You still have yours?" Julian nodded, showing the twin whistle he carried in his coat pocket. "Always." Ben grinned. "Then we're both safe." Back at Aurora Grid, chaos turned to clarity. Employees, engineers, field crews, analysts began volunteering after hours to inspect old buildings, patch furnace lines, and deliver heating pods. What started as a small act of conscience became a company-wide movement. Priya, the lead engineer, knocked on Julian's office door late that night. "We finished testing that AI-driven sensor module," she said. "It can detect manual shutoffs before they happen. We could deploy citywide." Julian leaned forward. "Do it, and rename the program." "To what?" He looked at the brass whistle on his desk. "Call it Warmline. It's not just data, it's a signal, like a whistle in the storm." Priya smiled softly. "That boy really changed you, didn't he?" Julian stared out at the city lights. "No, he reminded me who I was supposed to be." A few days later, the Attorney General's office announced indictments. Colton Realty's executives were arrested. Kane resigned under pressure. Public support for Aurora Grid's humanitarian branch skyrocketed, with donations matching corporate losses tenfold. But Julian didn't celebrate. He drove instead to the frozen riverbank by St. Anthony Falls, where the wind howled like distant memory. He stood there in silence, holding the whistle in one hand and the hardware crypto key in the other, the two smallest things that had changed the course of his life. He blew once into the whistle. The sound carried faintly across the ice. Behind him, someone laughed softly. He turned. Ben was there, bundled in his red scarf, Scout bounding at his feet. "Grandma said you'd come here," the boy said. Julian smiled. "How'd she know?" "She said you're the kind of man who needs to see the city breathe again before he can rest." Julian laughed quietly, crouching to the boy's height. "And what did you come to see?" Ben held up his sled. "The ice. It's cracking already. Means spring's coming." Julian looked across the river. "Yes, it does." The wind carried the faintest warmth. For the first time in months, Julian felt it on his face, not from heaters or systems, but from something simpler: hope. Far above the city, Aurora grid sensors pulsed in synchronized rhythm. A new AI protocol went live, scanning for any trace of cold silence. When it found one, it sent an alert tagged with 3 digital tones. Julian's final touch to the system. 3 tones, just like the whistle's signal. "I'm okay. I need help. Come quick." The code that once powered profit now carried compassion. Julian looked down at Ben beside him and said softly, "You dragged a fortune through the snow, Ben, but you gave something far greater back." Ben smiled up at him, wind tousling his hair. "You found it, Mr. Sloan." Julian frowned playfully. "Found what?" Ben pointed at the whistle. "Home." The man laughed, voice cracking with warmth. He looked back toward the skyline, his city alive again. The snowflake tie pin glinted faintly in the sunlight. The world, for once, felt perfectly still. For a few brief days, Minneapolis seemed to glow. Apartment windows lit like lanterns across neighborhoods that had been dark for months. Emergency lines quieted. Aurora Grid's Warmline project was praised on morning television, and letters poured in from families thanking the company for saving their loved ones during the blizzard. But peace never lasted long in Julian Sloan's world. The first sign of the next storm came as a thin envelope slid under his office door late that evening. No name, no return address, only a city seal embossed in faded blue. Inside was a subpoena. State Oversight Committee. Formal hearing on corporate governance and public utility ethics. Mara found him still holding it, unreadable. "They're calling you to testify?" she asked. Julian nodded slowly. "Next week. Capitol Building, St. Paul. They'll drag you through the mud." He smiled faintly. "If it keeps the light shining where it needs to, I'll walk through worse." The morning of the hearing broke sharp and colorless. News vans lined the steps of the Capitol, camera lenses fogging in the cold. Reporters shouted questions. "Mr. Sloan, did Aurora Grid profit from its relief program? Did you leak the Colton files for publicity?" Julian ignored them. His dark wool coat dusted with frost, red tie crisp against the gray sky. Inside, the marble corridors echoed with footsteps and murmurs. At the chamber doors, he paused. In his pocket, the brass whistle clinked softly against the hardware key. That small sound steadied him more than any lawyer's advice could. The hearing room was half courtroom, half theater. Lawmakers sat behind a curved dais. Kane, now disgraced but subpoenaed, occupied a seat across from Julian, jaw tight. Reporters lined the back row, pens poised. "Mr. Sloan," began the committee chair, "you initiated a citywide override during an active blizzard, reallocating power to non-paying tenants without municipal authorization. Were you aware that this was a breach of operational protocol?" "Yes," Julian said evenly. "I was aware." "Then why proceed?" He looked directly at her. "Because the law shouldn't be the reason people freeze to death in their homes." A low murmur spread across the room. The chair frowned. "Are you suggesting private corporations decide public safety?" "I'm suggesting," Julian said, his voice rising slightly, that technology means nothing without humanity guiding it. Aurora Grid's algorithms didn't fail. The humans overseeing them did, and I include myself in that failure. One senator leaned forward. And the leaked documents on Colton Realty, did you authorize that release? I did, Julian said, because hiding injustice behind non-disclosure clauses isn't protection, it's complicity. Across the table, Kane smirked. You grandstand well, Julian, but don't pretend this was selfless. You've turned tragedy into a publicity machine. Julian met his gaze calmly. You mistake visibility for vanity. The difference is intent. The committee chair raised a hand. Gentlemen, Mr. Sloan, final question. Do you stand by your actions despite financial loss to your shareholders? Julian straightened. I stand by the lives saved. Every one of them. If that costs me shareholders, so be it. If that costs me my title, so be it. But I won't stand by and let profit outweigh compassion ever again. The chamber fell silent. After a pause, the chair nodded once. This committee will recess for deliberation. Outside, snow had begun again, thin flurries spiraling like ash. Reporters swarmed the steps, microphones thrust forward. Mara shielded Julian as they pushed through. Mr. Sloan, one called out, do you think the board will remove you as CEO? Julian stopped, turning to face them. If leadership means silence, then maybe I shouldn't lead. But if it means standing in the cold until someone builds a fire, then yes, I still believe in leadership. The words made the evening news across the country. That night, at the Carter home, Ruth turned down the TV volume and smiled faintly. He's brave, she murmured. Ben nodded, eyes wide. Do you think he's scared? Of course he is, she said. Everyone who does the right thing is scared, but that's what makes it right. The boy fingered his whistle thoughtfully. Maybe I should go see him. Ruth chuckled. He might be busy saving the world again. Still, Ben said, standing. Sometimes heroes need to be reminded they're not alone. The next evening, Julian sat alone in his dim office. The board had not called, not yet. He stared at the faint city lights flickering through the snow and felt a strange emptiness, a quiet after too many storms. Then came a knock. He turned, surprised. Ben stood there, cheeks flushed from cold, Scout wagging his tail beside him. Ben? Julian rose, astonished. How did you get here? Bus, Ben said simply. And the guard let me up when I showed him this. He held out the brass whistle. Julian knelt, overwhelmed. You didn't have to. I know, Ben said. But you helped us when you didn't have to, so now it's my turn. Julian laughed softly, voice cracking. What exactly are you helping me with? Ben shrugged. Reminding you that people still believe in you. The man's composure finally broke. He pulled the boy into a brief, fierce hug. You have no idea what that means right now. Ben grinned. Then you're not allowed to quit. Julian smiled through the ache in his chest. Deal. Outside, the storm built again, but inside that office, warmth bloomed quietly. Steady, human, alive. Julian set the whistle on his desk beside the hardware key and the ledger, all three gleaming faintly under the lamplight. The tools of power, truth, and innocence, finally side by side. He looked out of the window again. You know something, Ben? Maybe the city isn't broken after all. It just needed a signal. Ben smiled. Then blow the whistle, Mr. Sloan. People will listen. Julian nodded slowly, hope rising in his chest like the first dawn after endless snow. The snow fell steady that night, turning the glass towers of downtown Minneapolis into shimmering spires of light. Inside Aurora Grid, the building pulsed with quiet hums from servers and wind howling faintly through the steel. Julian stood by the wide window, watching the flakes slide down like static on a silent screen. On his desk lay three things: the brass whistle Ben had given him, the carbon fiber briefcase with its root of trust key, and the ledger that had nearly cost him everything. 3 pieces of his life, honor, power, and truth, finally connected in one line. Behind him, Ben's voice broke the silence. "You really think they'll fire you?" Julian smiled faintly. "They might, but if that happens, I'll still have something no title can replace." Ben tilted his head. "What's that?" Julian looked over his shoulder. "My soul." The boy thought for a moment, then nodded like he understood. Scout barked softly as if in agreement. The next morning, the board convened early. The hearing had divided opinion. Investors feared collapse, but the public hailed Julian as the conscience of corporate America. Cameras waited outside the building for his statement. When Julian entered the conference room, the tension was thick. Edward Kane's seat sat empty. He'd resigned formally the night before. Around the table, the directors looked uneasy, each gauging the other's courage. The chairwoman cleared her throat. "Julian, before we begin, public sentiment is volatile. Your image is both our strength and our risk. We need a clear direction." Julian stood tall, voice even. "The direction hasn't changed. We keep people warm. That's what this company was born to do." One executive frowned. "And profitability?" He smiled faintly. "Follows warmth. Always has. Always will." Another muttered, "You sound like a preacher, not a CEO." Julian's blue eyes sharpened. "Then maybe you've forgotten what leadership really means." Silence. Then the chairwoman leaned forward, clasping her hands. "Julian, the board has voted. Despite your unconventional choices, the results speak for themselves. Warm Line's rollout reduced cold exposure emergencies by 70%. Donations and civic partnerships are offsetting revenue losses. The city is asking for expansion. The board stands with you." Julian blinked, caught off guard. "You're serious?" She smiled faintly. "We may not understand your methods, but we can't argue with the city that now sees Aurora Grid as its lifeline. Congratulations, Julian. You're officially reappointed as CEO, with full oversight on Warm Line." A wave of relief washed through him, but more than pride, it was gratitude, for the boy who'd dragged a fortune through the snow and given it back without asking anything in return. By mid-afternoon, Julian stood on the sky bridge between the executive tower and the operations hub. Engineers, technicians, and volunteers were gathered for the Warm Line launch ceremony, an initiative to provide free emergency heat pods and oxygen tanks for vulnerable residents. Priya handed him the remote to start the system. "It's ready," she said, smiling. "You sure you don't want a big speech?" "Cameras are rolling." Julian looked toward the crowd and spotted Ben standing beside Ruth, red scarf bright against the gray. He smiled. "I already gave my speech," he said softly. "Now, I just need to keep my promise." He pressed the button. On the massive screen behind him, thousands of dots lit up across a digital map of the city, each one a newly connected household. Every time a node blinked green, somewhere a heater roared back to life, or a family saw frost melt from their window. The crowd erupted in applause. Ben blew his whistle once, clear and bright, and Scout barked as if echoing the signal. Laughter rippled through the room. Julian lifted his own whistle from his pocket and answered with a single note. The sound carried through the atrium like a heartbeat between two friends. Later that night, after the crowd had gone, Julian walked down the empty hallway, his footsteps echoing softly against the marble. He paused by a window overlooking the snow-coated city, his city, now alive again. He pulled the ledger from his briefcase and placed it in a secure archive bin marked Public Record. It was done. The truth no longer needed guarding. Then he set the brass whistle beside his tie pin on the desk, aligning them perfectly. The small objects gleamed in the lamplight, reflections flickering like fire. He whispered quietly to himself, "That's the sound of change." Mara appeared at the doorway. "Reporters keep asking for quotes. I told them you'd give one tomorrow." Julian nodded absently. Tell them I'll meet them at the river." "The river?" she asked, puzzled, and he smiled faintly. "That's where this started. It's where it should end." The next morning, he stood at St. Anthony Falls again, coat collar turned up, scarf catching the breeze. The water below churned with ice flows, golden in the sunrise. He spoke softly into the recorder. "I used to believe leadership was about control, keeping systems stable, people predictable. But now I know. Leadership is about warmth. It's about staying human when it's easier to stay safe." He looked up as Ben approached, bundled in his parka, Scout trotting beside him. "You really came," Julian said. "Grandma said heroes keep promises." Ben grinned. Julian smiled. "She sounds wise." "She says you're part of the family now," Ben said shyly. "So, I brought you something." From his pocket, the boy pulled a tiny brass snowflake charm, freshly polished. "It's from Mom's old box. She said people who find home again should wear it." Julian swallowed hard, accepting it. "Thank you, Ben. I'll wear it always." He fastened it beside his tie pin, both glinting together in the morning sun. Ben blew his whistle, one short, one long, one short again. Julian laughed softly. "What's that code?" "It means," the boy said proudly, "I'm not alone anymore." Julian looked out over the water, voice catching. "Neither am I." Above them, the city's rooftops steamed faintly with heat, the breath of a place reborn. And for the first time in his life, Julian didn't feel like a man saving a city. He felt like a man finally belonging to one. From somewhere far off, the faint hum of Warmline's network pulsed through the air, soft and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. 3 tones echoed through every signal tower. "I'm okay. I need help. Come quick." And in a small apartment on Franklin Avenue, Ruth smiled as she heard the faint sound through her window, the promise of a world that remembered to care. Minneapolis wore sunlight like glass that morning, cold, clear, dazzling. The storm season was ending, and Aurora Grid's new Warmline system had stabilized the city's heartbeat. Across neighborhoods that had once gone dark in winter, orange light now poured through frosted windows. Inside the Aurora Grid headquarters, engineers clapped as new metrics streamed in. 0 fatalities due to cold exposure, one monitor read. Another, severe weather response time down 88%. Julian stepped into the command floor wearing his dark wool coat and that same red tie, the brass snowflake charm glinting beside his tie pin. For once, the building didn't hum with tension, it breathed. "Morning, boss," Priya called from her workstation. "Warmline's expansion just went live in Duluth and Fargo. We're officially interstate." Julian grinned. "I hope they're ready for the paperwork." She laughed. "We built this in 2 weeks. Paperwork doesn't scare us anymore." Mara entered with a tablet. "You've got a full day ahead. Press interviews, then the mayor's office wants to give you the City Humanitarian Award tonight." Julian made a face. "Do they serve coffee strong enough for that?" "Probably not," she said. "But Ruth and Ben will be there. They called to say they've never owned anything fancy enough for a ceremony." Julian smiled softly. "They don't need anything fancy. They've already got the one thing money can't buy: grace." That afternoon, Julian left the office early. He wanted to pick them up himself. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he walked up to the Carter bungalow, the one his team had renovated with a fresh furnace and energy-efficient windows. Through the frosted glass, he could see Ben on the floor with Scout, tinkering with a small drone that looked like a snowflake. When he knocked, Ben raced to the door. "Mr. Sloan, you're early." "Traffic was kind," Julian said, smiling. "Ready for your big night?" Ben shrugged, red scarf draped proudly over his new sweater. "Grandma says I clean up nice, but the drone's still missing one propeller." Julian laughed, crouching beside him. "Mind if I take a look?" He adjusted the wiring carefully, then handed it back. "There. Sometimes the smallest fix changes the whole flight." Ben grinned. "Just like you." Julian's heart twisted a little. "No, Ben. You're the one who changed the flight path. I just followed it." Ruth appeared in the doorway, wearing a pale blue coat and the calm smile of someone who'd survived too much to worry about appearances. "He's been rehearsing his thank you speech," she said. Ben blushed. "It's not that good." Julian smiled. "It doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be honest." That evening, the City Hall rotunda glowed under chandeliers. Reporters clustered at the edges, flashes sparking like fireflies. The mayor stepped up to the podium. "Tonight," she began, "we honor those who remembered the human heart behind technology. Aurora Grid transformed how we survive winter, not just with innovation, but with compassion." She gestured toward Julian, who stood beside Ben and Ruth. Applause filled the hall. Julian leaned toward Ben. "You ready?" The boy nodded nervously. "You go first." Julian stepped to the microphone. "A few months ago, I thought success meant control, more data, more power, fewer mistakes. But then I met a boy who reminded me that sometimes the smallest voice can carry the biggest truth." He looked down at Ben. "He dragged a fortune through the snow just to give it back. He didn't save a company, he saved its soul." The crowd grew quiet. Julian smiled at Ben and motioned him forward. The boy climbed a small step stool and faced the microphone. His brass whistle gleamed under the lights. Hi. I'm Ben Carter. I don't really know what to say, except thank you to Mr. Sloan for not giving up on us and for making sure people don't freeze anymore. My grandma says when someone helps you, you blow the whistle so they know you're okay." He raised it to his lips and blew one clear, bright note. The sound echoed through the chamber like a promise. The crowd erupted. Cheers, tears, laughter. Julian bent down, placed a hand on Ben's shoulder, and whispered, "That sound will stay with me forever." After the ceremony, reporters crowded in. One asked, "Mr. Sloan, what's next for Aurora Grid?" Julian smiled gently. "We'll keep building warmth where it's missing, and if we ever forget, I know someone who'll remind us." He glanced at Ben, who was busy explaining Scout's medal to a group of photographers. Ruth leaned close to Julian. "You gave him back his childhood, you know." Julian nodded slowly. "He gave me back my humanity." Later, as they left the hall, snow began to fall again, soft, weightless, forgiving. Ben tugged Julian's sleeve. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't found your case?" Julian looked down at him. "Every day." Ben's brow furrowed. "Do you think it was luck?" Julian smiled. "Maybe. Or maybe some things are just meant to find each other." He pulled the brass whistle from his pocket and handed it to Ben. "You should keep this one, too." Ben shook his head. "No, you need it." Julian crouched. "I think I'll always hear it, even if you keep both." The boy grinned and tucked the two whistles together on his necklace. "Then if I ever blow it, you'll come quick, right?" Julian smiled through the sting of emotion. "Always." That night, as they drove home through glittering streets, warm-line sensors pinged softly across the dashboard, a living symphony of safety and light. Every tone represented someone warm, someone alive. Ben fell asleep in the back seat, Scout's head resting on his knee. Ruth looked out the window, whispering, "I haven't seen the city this alive since she was here." Julian didn't ask who she meant. He already knew. He tightened his grip on the wheel, eyes reflecting the streetlights. "She'd be proud of him." "She'd be proud of you too," Ruth said quietly. Julian's throat tightened. "I just followed a whistle in the dark, Ruth." She smiled faintly, and found home. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft, endless, forgiving. And inside the car, for the first time that winter, every heart was warm. The first thaw came quietly. Snowbanks melted into shining rivers along curbs, and rooftops dripped with slow tears of winter giving up. In downtown Minneapolis, steam rose from manholes like the city itself exhaled after holding its breath too long. Julian Sloan stood at his office window, watching the world change colors, from steel gray to something resembling hope. His reflection looked older than when the storm began. Same sharp jawline, same deep blue eyes behind his glasses, but softened now. Less armor, more heart. On his desk sat a small wooden box. Inside were mementos from the last few months, the brass whistle, the snowflake charm, the red scarf folded neatly. He opened the box, ran a thumb over the whistle's smooth curve, and smiled faintly. A knock at the door. "Come in." Mara entered, carrying her tablet. "You're going to want to see this." He turned. "Good news or bad?" "Both, depending on how you look at it." She set the screen on his desk. It showed a video feed. Streets lined with volunteers in Aurora Grid jackets, distributing new portable heat capsules. Warmline's national rollout started at dawn. Chicago, Denver, Detroit, Buffalo, 20 cities in one morning. Julian blinked. "Already?" "They pushed it up after your testimony," she said with a smile. "Turns out Congress passed emergency winter funding with Aurora Grid as the technical backbone. Your hearing inspired a policy bill, Julian. They're calling it the Sloan Amendment." He let out a slow laugh. "I didn't do it alone." "No," Mara said softly, "but you proved it was possible." She hesitated before adding, "There's something else. The Attorney General's office finished the Colton case. Guilty pleas on all counts. You won't need to testify again." Julian exhaled deeply, a weight he didn't realize he still carried slipping off his shoulders. "Then it's over." "Almost," she said. "There's a letter for you from Ben." He opened it after she left. The handwriting was small, careful. "Dear Mr. Sloan, Grandma says you probably have too many emails, so I'm writing a real letter instead. I finished the snow drone. It works now. Scout chases it, but I'm teaching him not to. I want to tell you something important. Next year, I'm entering the City Science Fair. My project's called AI That Hears Whistles. It's about how sound can tell machines where to help. I think Mom would have liked that. Grandma says when someone saves your life, you don't owe them anything. You just have to live it right. So I'm going to." Ben, Julian's eyes blurred halfway through. He read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in the wooden box beside the scarf. AI That Hears Whistles. The phrase lingered in his mind like music. That evening, he drove to Franklin Avenue one last time before spring. The streets looked different now, cleaner, brighter. The old apartment building where Ruth and Ben once shivered in darkness stood boarded and empty. The city had condemned it for renovation. Across the street, children played in the slush, their laughter rising above the rumble of snowplows. Ruth's new bungalow glowed at the end of the block. He knocked, and Scout's bark answered before the door swung open. "Mr. Sloan!" Ben ran out, red scarf fluttering. "Grandma's baking pie. Apple." Julian smiled. "I might just stay forever." Ruth appeared, flour dusting her hands. "You'd better eat fast then, before he does." They laughed together, and the sound filled the warm little house like light. At dinner, Ben couldn't stop talking. His project, his drone, how the mayor's office wanted him to demonstrate at City Hall. "They said my AI model could help emergency crews find people who need heat," he said, eyes glowing. Julian listened quietly, moved beyond words. Ruth smiled knowingly. "You're looking at your legacy, you know." Julian blinked. "Legacy?" She nodded. "You gave him a world that listens." He looked at Ben, who was explaining how his drone used whistle frequencies to locate signals faster than GPS. The boy's hands waved with excitement, the brass whistle clinking softly around his neck. Julian smiled. "Then I guess my work's in good hands." Later, after dinner, he stepped outside into the cool air. The snowmelt glittered under streetlights, and a low wind swept past carrying the scent of thawing earth. He looked up at the stars, clear for the first time all season. Ben followed him out, Scout bounding at his heels. "You're leaving soon, huh?" Julian nodded. "New projects, new cities. But I'll be back." The boy nodded solemnly. "Promise?" Julian reached into his coat and pulled out a small silver key. "This opens the volunteer lab downtown," he said. Every Saturday, the engineers test new bots. I put your name on the list. Ben's mouth fell open. Really? Julian smiled. You're part of this now, Ben. Aurora Grid doesn't just belong to me anymore, see? It belongs to you and everyone who listens for the call. The boy gripped the key tightly. Then I'll make sure it never goes dark. Julian's eyes softened. I know you will. He crouched to Scout, scratching behind his ears. Keep watching over them, buddy. Scout barked once as if agreeing. Ben raised his whistle and gave the 3 short blasts, clear and bright against the night air. Julian answered softly with his own. The echoes met halfway, a harmony of promise carried on the wind. Back downtown, as he walked into the empty Aurora Grid lobby, the night guard waved. Storm's over, huh, Mr. Sloan? Julian smiled. For now. He looked up at the wall where a new plaque had been mounted. Aurora Grid Foundation. Because warmth is not a luxury, it's a right. Beneath the inscription was a small brass whistle encased in glass, engraved with 6 words. Dragged a fortune. Gave it back. Julian stood there a long time, hands in his pockets, the faint hum of the servers vibrating through the building like a pulse. Outside, wind carried the distant sounds of children playing, laughter mixing with melting snow. The city was breathing again. He whispered under his breath, You did it, Ben. Then he turned toward the elevator, ready for what came next. The following winter came early. By mid-November, the Mississippi was already skinned with ice, and the sky hung low over Minneapolis like a lid. But this time, no one feared the cold. The city had changed. Every block alive with humming heat vents and the soft glow of Aurora Grid's warm line pods. At the company's command center, the first seasonal storm alert triggered a chime instead of a siren. Green lights pulsed across the map. Every signal meant a household ready, every sensor alive. Julian stood among the operators, coat draped over his arm, watching as the screens flickered. How many homes are online? He asked. Priya smiled from her console. All of them. For the first time in history, 0 offline nodes citywide. Julian let out a breath that fogged faintly in the cold air from the open loading bay. Then we did it. No, you did it, Mara said from behind him, approaching with her tablet. Congress just approved funding for a national warm line initiative. They're calling it Project Hearth. Julian raised an eyebrow. That sounds like something you'd name a fireplace. That's the point, she said. You turned a company into one. He smiled faintly, rubbing his thumb against the small brass snowflake charm on his tie. We just reminded people how to light it. That evening, he drove across the river to the Carter bungalow. It was tradition now. First snow, first dinner together. Through the window, he saw Ben at the kitchen table, soldering something under a small desk lamp. Scout dozed at his feet. Julian knocked once and heard Ruth's familiar voice call, "Come in before you freeze, dear." The house smelled like cinnamon and warm bread. Ben looked up with a grin. "You're right on time. Look what I built." He lifted a small cube-shaped drone painted silver, a faint whistle engraved on one side. It listens for distress signals during storms, like Warmline, but smaller. I named it Ori. Julian smiled, kneeling beside him. Ori, huh? After Aurora Grid? Ben nodded proudly. And after you, because you brought the light. Ruth chuckled from the stove. Don't let it go to your head, Julian. He laughed. Too late. Ben tilted his head. It still needs a test flight. You think the snow's good enough? Julian checked the window. Flakes were falling slow and soft, blanketing the streetlights. Perfect night for it. They bundled up and stepped outside. The wind was gentle this time, brushing across the quiet block. Ben placed the drone on the sidewalk and pressed a small button. It hummed to life, then lifted smoothly into the air, tiny propellers slicing through the falling snow. Look, Ben shouted, laughing. It works. Julian threw back his head and laughed too, full, unguarded. The cold bit his cheeks, but the sound that left his chest was pure warmth. For a moment, the world was just snow, laughter, and light. Later, inside, as Ruth poured hot cocoa, she looked at Julian with that same wise softness. "You've done something rare," she said. "You gave the city warmth, but you gave the boy a future." Julian's voice dropped. "He gave me one first." Ruth smiled. "Then you're even." Ben bounded back in, scarf half unraveled, eyes wide. "Grandma! Mr. Sloan! The news just said warm lines expanding to Alaska. That's the coldest place ever." Julian grinned. "Then I guess we'd better keep up." Ruth handed him a mug. "You look happy, Julian." He nodded, watching the steam rise from the cocoa. "For the first time, I think I am." A week later, at the Aurora Grid Winter Gala, Julian stood on stage before his employees, the entire hall glowing with candlelight and screens showing live warmth data. "We built this company to fight cold," he told them, "but we ended up fighting indifference. And that battle, we won together." The crowd erupted in applause. But as he stepped down from the podium, his phone buzzed. A warm line alert. Not a malfunction, but a request. Manual distress signal detected, Franklin Avenue. His heart clenched. He opened the map. One blinking dot. 10 minutes later, his car screeched to a stop outside the Carter home. Snow swirled violently, thicker than before. He sprinted up the porch steps. "Ben! Ruth!" Ruth opened the door, laughing breathlessly. "He's fine. It was a test, dear. His new drone sent the signal on purpose." Julian blinked, half laughing, half scolding. "You almost gave me a heart attack." Ben appeared from the hallway, holding the little silver drone. "It worked. I wanted to see if Warmline would hear me." Julian knelt, ruffling his hair. "It heard you loud and clear, kid. You built something incredible." Ben smiled shyly. "Guess we both did." Julian nodded. "You're the proof, Ben. The world only changes when someone small decides to be brave." The boy hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out one of the two brass whistles. "You should take this back," he said softly. "I think you'll need it for the next storm." Julian stared at him, emotion thick in his throat. "You sure?" Ben smiled. "Yeah. I've got my voice now." Julian took it gently, closing his fingers around the familiar weight. "Then I'll keep it safe." That night, back in his office, Julian placed the whistle beside the carbon fiber briefcase. Snow fell softly against the windows, light bouncing off the steel and glass. He could hear faint laughter from the streets below, families celebrating the warmth, children chasing snowflakes instead of fearing them. He whispered into the quiet, "That's the sound of a city healed." Then he blew the whistle once. The note echoed across the skyline, pure and bright. In dozens of homes, sensors lit green. Somewhere in the system's heartbeat, a little drone named Ori recognized the sound and responded with a single flash of blue light, its first signal sent to the network. Julian smiled. The system, the city, and the boy, it all worked. Outside, snow kept falling, but this time it felt like grace. Winter lingered into March, but it no longer frightened anyone. The city that once froze in silence now hummed with quiet, reliable warmth, streets alive with the hiss of working vents, the glow of street lamps haloed in mist. Aurora Grid had become less a company and more a pulse beneath Minneapolis, a silent promise that no one would be left out in the cold again. Julian Sloan stood at the riverfront just before dawn. The ice along the Mississippi was breaking up, jagged white plates drifting downstream in lazy rhythm. He wore his navy overcoat and red tie, the brass snowflake charm gleaming beside his tie pin. The whistle Ben had returned to him hung around his neck. Its metal was cold, but it felt alive, like a heartbeat waiting to be heard. Behind him, footsteps crunched on the path. "Knew I'd find you here," Mara said, her breath fogging in the cold. "You always come to the water before something big." Julian smiled faintly. "It helps me remember where it started." She joined him at the railing. "The board approved the expansion this morning. Aurora Grid's officially going international, Montreal, Oslo, Reykjavik. You're going to have to get used to foreign interviews. Julian chuckled softly. As long as they have coffee. Mara's tone softened. You've done something rare, Julian. You didn't just build tech. You built trust. People believe in you again. He looked toward the horizon, where faint pink light edged the clouds. I didn't do it alone. A boy showed me how. A week later, the Carter home buzzed with commotion. Cameras were set up in the yard, neighbors waving American flags as the mayor's car pulled up. Ben stood at the door, trying to straighten his sweater, the red scarf wrapped snugly around his neck. Ruth fussed behind him. You're representing all of us, sweetheart. Try not to slouch. I'm trying, he protested, grinning nervously. Julian arrived moments later, snow still in his hair from the drive. Sorry I'm late, he said, smiling. The city insists on sending escorts now. Feels strange. Ruth laughed. You'd better get used to it. You're famous, Mr. Sloan. He shook his head. No, we're famous. This started right here. The mayor stepped forward, cameras flashing. Today, we honor the Carter family and Aurora Grid for transforming how this city faces winter. We'd like to present our newest Citizen Award to Benjamin Carter for inspiring a movement through honesty and courage. Ben's mouth fell open. Me? Julian leaned down. Looks that way. The mayor placed a small medal around Ben's neck, a silver snowflake engraved with the city's seal. You taught Minneapolis the meaning of integrity. Applause erupted. Ruth clapped through tears. Scout barked as if trying to join in. Ben turned to Julian. Do you think Mom can see this? Julian's throat tightened. I think she's been watching all along. That evening, after the reporters left, the two of them sat on the porch watching the sky turn from gold to indigo. The streets were quiet, warm lights flickering in every window. Mr. Sloan? Ben asked softly. When you first lost your briefcase, were you scared? Julian smiled. More than I care to admit. Why? He looked toward the horizon. Because I didn't know what I'd lost yet. Not just the key, but the part of myself that cared about what really matters. Finding you helped me find that again. Ben kicked at the snow. Grandma says people are like seasons. Some just need a little thaw to change. Julian nodded. She's right. He reached into his pocket and handed Ben a small, wrapped box. Here, for you. Ben tore the paper carefully. Inside was a sleek, new digital whistle, engraved with Warmline Prototype 001 and his initials, BC. It's connected to the city network, Julian explained. If you ever blow it, no matter where you are, Warmline will answer first. Ben's eyes widened. Really? Julian nodded. Because heroes deserve a line straight to help. The boy grinned. Then we're even now. Not even, Julian said softly. We're family. Weeks passed, and the thaw deepened. Ben's drone project won first place at the city science fair. The newspapers ran headlines. The boy who changed winter. But when reporters asked for comments, Ben always said the same thing. I just did what my mom taught me. Aurora Grid opened its first community lab that spring, a renovated warehouse filled with students building prototypes from recycled tech. Ben volunteered there every Saturday, wearing his whistle and red scarf like a badge. Julian often stopped by quietly, standing in the doorway as the boy explained circuits to younger kids. Each time, that sight reminded him that warmth wasn't measured in kilowatts, it was measured in connection. On the first anniversary of the storm, the city held a remembrance at the river. Candles floated on the water, thousands of flickering points of light drifting under the bridges. Julian stood beside Ben and Ruth, the cold air crisp but gentle. The mayor spoke briefly, then gestured to Julian. Mr. Sloan, would you honor us by sounding the whistle that started it all? Julian looked down at Ben. You ready? Ben nodded. Together, they lifted their whistles and blew 3 notes into the night. The sound spread through the crowd, carried by wind and water. And, as if answering, the city's Warmline towers glowed gold for 1 minute, an entire network pulsing with life, remembering the signal that had once saved it. Ruth whispered, That's your mother's song, Ben. The boy smiled, tears bright in his eyes. Then I guess we finally finished it. Julian rested a hand on his shoulder. No, kid, he said softly. You started it. Later, when the candles were gone and the crowd dispersed, Julian lingered at the river's edge. The brass whistle hung warm against his chest despite the chill. He lifted it once more and whispered, "For every storm that still needs a signal." He blew one soft note. From far off, a distant echo answered. Clear, bright, unmistakable. Ben's. Julian smiled through the mist, his breath a ghost in the cold air. The wind carried the sound between them, then out across the sleeping city that now knew how to listen. And for the first time, even winter felt warm.